Hey guys, welcome back to another video. This is Troy with Cichlid Bros. In today's video, I am showing how I maintain all 8 of my big aquariums plus my koi pond. In total, that is about 2,500 gallons of water down here in my basement. So I definitely have to be smart about how I maintain this aquarium, so I'm not doing it every minute of every day, but I'm going to show the step-by-step process of what I do, so let's dive right in. So starting off here is my 180 gallon South American Cichlid tank. It has recently gone through some changes, but before it had some big cichlids, including some Oscars, Severums, Geophagus, and because there were some big fish in there and they couldn't really go with live plants, the nitrates would slowly build, and that's really the reason for a lot of the maintenance I do, especially when it comes to the water changes. It is so that you can reduce the nitrates that have been building up in your aquarium. I try to keep mine below 20 parts per million. I would just recommend getting a simple test kit and you could check your own levels. But when I had those big cichlids in this tank, my sweet spot was about 30% of a water change every week, and I would usually do that on a Saturday or Sunday, and I try to stick to that as best as possible. While the tank was draining, I would put the Cichlid Ultra Zero pump on the Python and it would fast and efficiently drain the tank. And because I have good filtration, flow, and geophagus in this tank, I really never needed to gravel vac the sand or the substrate. It just didn't need to be done. And as the tank is draining from the pump, that is when I get out my algae scrubber and try to wipe off anything that's accumulated on the panel. I try to keep my light pretty dim and on for only viewing hours so that the algae isn't growing too much. But I just take a simple shower scrubber that I bought off Amazon and I wipe down the panel as the tank is draining. That way some of that waste and algae is going through the pump and out of the tank. And once that is complete and the tank is drained about 30%, I remove the pump, unplug it, and then I put the Python hose back together, and then I turn my faucet back on to fill. And as the tank is filling, that is when I add dechlorinator into the tank. And I'd usually do that right when it starts filling up, but I think you could basically do it at any point as the tank is filling up. I've never had an issue doing it this way, and I've probably done over 1,000 water changes. Never had a fish harmed by any type of water change, especially when you're adding the water directly from the tap plus dechlorinator. But then the tank is full and I just turn on the filters, the wave makers, the heaters, and everything starts running again. The only other thing I would say I do on this tank regularly, or at least I try to, is cleaning the filters. So I have 2 canister filters on this tank. I always love having 2 filters for redundancy, so if you're cleaning one, the other is unaffected when it comes to beneficial bacteria or any type of issues you may have with one of the filters. So I try to do one of the filter cleanings once every 3 to 4 months. So that means each canister filter gets cleaned about twice a year. So that is the overall maintenance I do on the 180, and it is different from all my other tanks, and I'll explain why throughout the video. The other thing to note with this is now that the stocking has changed, all the big cichlids have moved out and now it's just the electric blue acara, things have changed a little bit, so I don't have to do water changes quite as often. There's not as much waste being produced or food going into the tank. It's just kind of keeping the tank cycled until I have some permanent fish coming in here, and then my water change schedule and maintenance schedule will change again. So right now for this tank I'm only doing about 20% every 2 weeks, and the electric blue acara are just fine. There are little fish in a big tank, so that's just an example of how your water change schedule might change depending on the variables that you have in your own tank. So next up, I know many of you want to know what I do on my big plywood aquarium that I just built. Let's go to that next. So I'm currently doing water change on the 500 gallon plywood aquarium. As you can see, it's a little bit hazy from the tannins from the driftwood and from some of the algae I just wiped off the glass. I used the same shower scrubber that I use on my 180 gallon aquarium. You can see my DIY lid is off because I was in the tank accessing it. But also with the Python here, it is connected to the Cichlid Ultra Zero pump. Also the same pump that I use on a lot of my big tanks. With that, it drains the tank much faster than if you just had the faucet on or let gravity do its job. So this is definitely a huge plus. It helps me drain the tank. And this is only one of my first water changes on this tank, but I will probably do about 40%, maybe 30% every week or two, depending on the nitrate levels in this tank. So I will be testing the water regularly on this tank, especially during the first 3 months, so I can really lock in the percent I need to take out depending on the food and the fish that are in here. so I can really lock in those levels in terms of percentages. So we are almost at about 30% here. I'm going to go ahead and unplug and remove the pump and then put the end of the Python back on, and we're going to start filling the tank now. So we got the end of the Python hose now on there, and as the tank is filling, I added the dechlorinator, so everything is fine. As the tank fills, you try to get the temperature as close as possible to the tank water, so just turn on the heat a little bit until it's about the same temperature, and then you just let it fill. So the next tank, we're going to go across the room to my new saltwater aquarium, where there's recently been some changes to what I do in that tank. So next up is something I'm really excited about that's really going to help me maintain my aquariums and provide really good water quality for a couple of my tanks. So this is the water drop RO system, and RO stands for reverse osmosis. And you may remember when I had a bigger saltwater tank, I did have an RODI system that was specifically made for that tank so that I could get clean, fresh water that I would then mix with salt water. And even though that system did work for me, I did always have to have it hooked up to my faucet, which was always a hassle whenever I was switching back and forth between that and my Python anytime I was doing a water change. And I also had to wait a long time for the drip to come through and accumulate enough water for my big water changes. And now that I have a saltwater aquarium again, I have the 15-gallon Hello Reef aquarium here, I did want to invest in something that could give me RO water and fast so that I could easily mix the salt water for that tank. And I'm going to be setting up a couple nano aquariums for shrimp in the future. It's going to be a really cool project, and this RO water will also work well for that. And depending on how things go, I may even use it for my Discus aquarium or some of my other tanks, depending on how much water I'm getting from this. And there's going to be some great benefits to this outside of my aquariums. I'm going to be able to use this for regular drinking water, to have purified water ready to go all the time. I've messed around with Brita filters, and they're always a pain to refill. Put them back in the fridge, lug them back out. So this is going to be a really compact unit that's going to help me with my aquariums and everyday use. So that's why I figured the investment was worth it. Let's go ahead and unbox it, set it up, and show how I'm going to use it. So this is the box it came in, and you can get it right off Amazon if you're interested in something like this for yourself. But let's go ahead and check out the unit. And it looks like this hose is connected to the faucet. So this actual faucet will be installed in my kitchen sink upstairs right next to my regular faucet, and this looks pretty high tech from the pictures. Yep, you can see it right here. It'll have some LED monitors showing you how much TDS you have and just overall ounces that you're pouring at a time. But this is the big unit itself. Looks really nice and compact and in a nice casing here, so it'll look pretty good under the sink. I'm going to show the install now. Hopefully that goes pretty smoothly. I think it looks pretty easy to set up, and we'll get to that now. You can see the water comes out really fast, and you just hit that top button anytime you need a refill. You can change the ounces. The TDS also says it's pretty low already for the first glass. Gonna go ahead and try it. Not only does it taste good, but I also really like the intelligent faucet here. It looks really nice here in my kitchen. And I think it tastes good because it keeps some of the essential minerals and it keeps that pH really optimal for your health. And it comes out of the faucet really fast. I think it does 1,200 gallons per day, which is awesome. And it is a tankless RO, so it's a really compact unit right underneath my sink. You don't need anything extra to get this water. And within the unit, you can see the different purification stages. There are 11 of them, so this gives you really pure drinking water and great healthy water for my fish. See under the sink that it fits nice and snugly, and it was really easy to install other than drilling that hole up top. And you can see notifications anytime your filters need to be changed, but I think they last a pretty long time. And then you just have your drains and inlets and everything plugged in the back. So pretty cool. So I went ahead and put the new RO water directly into the bucket. The TDS was very low, so it was perfect. I just put some salt in here to mix it up, and after a day or two, this will be ready to go into the new tank for a water change. So let's go. next up we have my two big custom aquariums. This is my 150 gallon tank and this is my 135, and there is a lot of differences into what I do for each of these tanks. First off, this is my 150 that has a lot of anubias and live plants in here. So live plants will be consuming those nitrates, and when I test my water, the nitrates hardly ever creep up to that 10 to 20 parts per million range. So I only do a water change on this tank once every 2 months. I usually do about a 25 to 30% water change every 2 months on this tank, and the nitrates stay down. I don't sand vac or gravel vac for the same reasons I mentioned before. I have really good water flow and the geophagus. The other thing I do with each of my water changes here is removing the filter floss from the sump. And the sump is super easy to clean because you can just take things out as you're doing your maintenance. I just remove the filter floss and add new ones. I've never actually had to clean off the biomedia in the sump because it doesn't clog up and it's just really good material. And then the pump itself, the Cichlid Tank SDC, I've only had to do maintenance on this pump one time in the 3 years that this tank has been set up, so it's been a super easy filter to maintain. The only other thing I would say I do regularly on this tank is using the flipper float. I just wipe down the glass panel. You could flip it to the blade side or use the finer pad to get off any algae that's accumulating on the glass. It's usually only just a little bit of biofilm, but just doing a quick pass probably once every 2 or 3 days, and this tank always looks pristine, always crystal clear. It's just an incredible tank. I've loved it over the years, and just another plus to it is that the maintenance schedule is pretty low effort. So next up is my 135 gallon African Cichlid tank. This is my other custom aquarium, and it also has the seamless sump below it. The maintenance schedule is very different from my other tanks. Normally when you have an African Cichlid tank, you're going to be doing really big water changes and doing them often to keep up with the nitrates that build up, because usually you need to overstock your African Cichlid tank to avoid aggression. It's just kind of the recommended way of stocking those tanks, and those fish can't have live plants. They'll absolutely destroy or eat them, so that means a lot of water changes. However, this tank has a bit of a secret weapon. It has a clear water algae scrubber in the sump. So this is continuously pumping water through this confined area with lights on both sides, which grows algae, and algae, just like any other live plants, consumes nitrates. So this unit has been an absolute workhorse for me and saved a lot of water and my time, because I only do water changes on this tank once every 6 weeks, and I just do about a 25% water change because the nitrates never creep up above 20 parts per million in this tank, so it's just a really low effort as well. The other thing I do in this sump, just like the other tank with the sump, is change out the filter floss often. Even if I'm not doing any water change, sometimes every couple weeks I'll just swap out the floss. It's super cheap and just bulks up the mechanical filtration and any debris that might be floating around in the tank. This tank has been running for 1.5 years and I've never done maintenance or cleaning on the Cichlid Tank SDC pump in this tank. I might need to soon, but just a really efficient pump, and it doesn't ever really need service, so I just let it run and don't disturb it, but eventually I'll clean or rinse it off just a little bit. But the last thing I do on this tank is just pull out the mat in the algae scrubber, and I do what they call harvesting, which is scraping off the algae from that mat and then putting it back in the unit to regrow the algae, because as the algae is growing, that is when it's consuming the most nitrates. So they recommend harvesting the algae anytime it's kind of bulked up in your system, and for me that's been about once every 2 months, and it takes me just a few seconds to wipe off that mat. But what you'll see with most of these big tanks is that the process is really similar. The products I use are mostly the Python, the Cichlid Ultra Zero pump, a good dechlorinator, and the flipper algae scrapers. Everything else is just fine-tuning the schedule for the tank, knowing roughly what your nitrates creep up to and when, so that tells you how much you need to do a water change and what percentage. So that's why I have slightly different schedules for each of these tanks. Another thing to mention is with these big aquariums especially, I try and stagger the days that I do water changes, so maybe a Wednesday night for 2 of the tanks, maybe a Saturday for 2 of the others. It just saves the hot water in my house, and also my time and mental capacity for doing so many water changes is limited, so I've found that that's just the best way for me to do it on a weekly basis. And then the 90-gallon Discus tank, this is full of live plants again, so similar to the 150, that's consuming a lot of the nitrates. I don't have to do quite as many water changes on this tank as I typically would have, but Discus do prefer super clean water, so I do a water change on this tank about 30 to 40% every week. Even though it does have live plants, I just go ahead and do it because it keeps the nitrates very, very low, and also I can remove any algae that's building up. Over the last few months, some hair algae and green algae has been in the tank, so those extra water changes help remove that algae and make the tank continue to look really great. And then this is my backyard koi pond, which is about 1,500 gallons, and it has 6 koi in here. All are doing really well, but this is very low maintenance because all I really have to do is top off this koi pond. I do it a little more frequently because there is a little bit of a leak in the waterfall that I have to fix. So the normal evaporation plus that leak, I have to top off this pond probably once every 10 days or so. And then I will also clean out the basket that is in the skimmer, which has leaves and any other debris and waste accumulating in there. I'll just dump it out. Very minimal on this. The rainwater itself kind of does the water changes for me, so it's really nice. And as you can see, all the koi want some food. So last but not least, we can't forget about the work in progress fish room, which at the moment only has 3 aquariums, the 75-gallon tank with the 2 Cuban cichlids, the 40-gallon breeder that is a cold water aquarium with some pretty unique species, and then a 33-gallon with my shell dwellers. I just use the Python, but I have an extension to the hose because it needs to reach all the way into that fish room. And then for the 75-gallon tank, I do a 30% water change every 2 weeks. And as I do that, I just use the flipper to wipe down the algae, fill it back up with the chlorinator, and we're good to go. The 2 filters on this tank, I try again to clean one of those once every 3 months, and I alternate between the 2. One's a canister, one's I hang on the back. I also remove the filter floss from the hang on the back regularly, just like my sumps. And then when it comes to the 40-gallon tank here, it is a cold water aquarium, but you'll see it does have a good amount of anubias plants, so I only do a 25% water change every month on this tank rather than weekly. And again, I try and stagger it with the big tanks so that I'm doing maybe the fish room all at once and then the big tanks on different days. But also I wipe off the front panel regularly to get any algae off of it. A lot of times it does accumulate algae on the front panel here, but I just wipe that off. And then I have 2 Sea-Chem Tidal hang on the back filters, and I alternate cleaning those because they're smaller units. Try to rinse off the media in these filters as I do those water change, so I'm doing it a bit more frequent than my other big tanks. I'm rinsing off that media every month whenever I'm doing the actual water change. And last but not least is my 33-gallon shell dweller tank, and this one's super simple. I do a 25% water change every 2 weeks. This only has a couple live plants, so that's not really doing much. And there is a pretty good amount of shell dwellers after they have bred so much, so that's a good percentage to keep the nitrates at a good level for them. The only other thing with this tank, it does have a curved front panel, so the sand and algae really gets annoying on this tank. I have to be extra diligent cleaning off with the algae scraper every time I do a water change to make it look somewhat decent, although the shell dwellers destroy it, so this tank has never been pretty. This is more of a how I do things with a little bit of the why I do it, but I'm going to do a full video on water changes and if they're actually necessary and needed for you, so keep an eye out for that. That's going to be coming very soon. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.